So for this final chapter of Volume 2, Introducing Maya 2023, I want to introduce a few of the advanced modules that are part of Maya or have been part of Maya for a while. Maya, as you know, is a very deep program, so there's lots of stuff to explore and discover in it. I just want to give you kind of a little bit of a taste here so you can go on and explore, or at least so you have a basic idea of what these terms refer to as you're working around in Maya. So let's start with paint effects. So if I go to the modeling menu set, under Generate, I'm going to choose Generate Get Brush. This opens up the content browser to the paint effects folder. So it has a bunch of subfolders in here, and these are all examples of various paint effects. So paint effects is a brush-based system. It's pretty good for things like really simple plants and really simple hair. A lot of the other stuff in here, they've got some really goofy and interesting things in here. I don't know that you'll be using light bulbs a whole lot with paint effects, but you never know. Let's take a look at something nice and simple. I'm going to go to grasses and find, let's do grass wind wide. So I'm going to select this, and you can see when it's selected, it has a blue border. And then I'm just going to use the paintbrush and just paint here on the grid. You can see we have some basic grass. And if I press the play button, you can see it has a really simple kind of procedural wind. It's not actual dynamics or anything like that. It's just kind of a random procedural noise that simulates the effect of wind. And then, of course, if I stop this, we can see that in the outliner, we have a stroke node that has both transform and shape, and then the curve, which is the curve that I actually painted to create the stroke. And then there's a third node associated with paint effects. So if I select the shape node and take a look in the attribute editor, we have our shape node here, but we also have this node, grass wind wide. This is the stroke node. So if I go in here to display and turn off DAG objects only, as this node right here. It's like the template. So I can go into the attribute editor for this node and start to play with some of these settings. And generally speaking, when you're working with paint effects, actually it's this one right here. Yeah. When you're working with paint effects, it's basically you paint the basic stroke, and then you use the manipulator to design the shape of the stroke. And so we could go down here to creation, and under tubes, control the number of tubes per stroke, the length, width, randomness, and even down here along the displacement, we can add like noise and that kind of stuff. So it's a lot of twiddling of dials and that kind of stuff to kind of customize the stroke. So you get something looking like seaweed there. And then we can go down here to the turbulence and adjust, say, the frequency and the speed and all kinds of good stuff like that to create a kind of a different type of wind. And then we have different styles of wind, like tree wind versus grass versus local displacement, world displacement. Where this can also be useful is you can paint on surfaces. So let's go in here and turn on DAG objects only. And I'm just going to select these and delete them. And I'm going to create a polygon sphere. Let's scale it up a bit. Whenever you paint on a surface, it could be a NURB surface, it could be a polygon surface, but it does mean that you have to have UVs in order for the paint effects to work, and not overlapping UVs, but just decent UV texture coordinates. Creating a basic sphere already comes with UVs, so we should be good. So now what I want to do is, with the object selected, I want to go into Generate and choose Make Paintable, which will mean that Paint Effects knows that you want to paint on top of this particular surface, the selected surface. So I'll go down here and choose Make Paintable. And then let's go in here and choose a different brush. Let's say a flower. Maybe daisies. So I have this loaded now. So you can see the blue border. It means it's loaded. And then I'm going to hold the B key and increase my brush size and then drag on the surface. And you can see we have daisies. I don't believe these have any animation on them. But if I go into the stroke daisy large, this is again what controls the shape of the stroke. And then you can increase tubes per step, segments, just like I was doing before. Play around with this, and then you can see under growth, we also have the ability to increase number of branches and flower petals and so on and so forth. So Again, procedural animation tool, and you can convert these guys into polygons. So right now, these are procedural element that won't necessarily render with Arnold or other rendering software. But if you go into the modify menu with this selected, you could choose convert paint effects to polygons. It will convert it to a polygon object. So you'll see here is the polygon object in a group. The stems, the leaf, the flowers. This still has a history connection with the stroke. So I can go in here and go back to my stroke node and continue to make adjustments and modify the flowers, even though they've been converted to polygons. If you want to break that connection, you can delete history on the object, and then it just makes it a static object. But if it's polygons, now you can do things like apply Arnold shaders and other textures, or if you're using another renderer, you can get these guys to render in another software. It does a pretty good job. I mean, for distant flowers, this works pretty well. For really simple hair, paint effects are great. Like I said, those are the main things that I use it for. So let's talk about dynamics and effects in Maya. It's been part of Maya for a long time, and for a while, Maya dominated when it came to creating dynamic effects for visual effects, movies, TV, games, and that kind of stuff. Houdini has now, of course, the dominant software package for that style of animation, and with good reason. Houdini is a great program, but Maya effects tools are still really good in a pinch, and you can do some great stuff with them. I'm going to go to the effects menu set and take a look at N particles. So N stands for nucleus, which is the main system for creating dynamics in Maya. It's not the only system, but it's the main system. If you look at the N particles menu down here, we have legacy particles. So these are the old particles that have been around since the early days of Maya. They're pretty good, but they require a bit more work in terms of putting together expressions and that kind of stuff. Nucleus or N particles are both more powerful but also easier to use than the traditional particles. So most of the time you're going to want to use N particles. I very rarely need to use these legacy particles. So let's take a quick look at how to work with N particles. What you want to do is probably create an emitter as the easiest way to get a particle system into Maya. So I'll hit create emitter, and then you can see we have a little N here with an arrow pointing down. And then we have the emitter right here, and you can see here's the attribute editor. So if I press play, we can see there's particles coming out and they're kind of falling. So I'm going to stop this and let's set the timeline to like 300. And then take a look at the nodes here in the outliner. So we have the emitter node, the particles themselves, and then nucleus. So nucleus is the overall dynamic system. This controls things like gravity, how the other dynamic systems interact with each other, and stuff like that. You can actually have more than one nucleus node in a scene if you really need it, but most of the time you're going to just have the one nucleus node. And if I create, let's say, I'm going to create a polygon sphere and move this down and maybe scale it up. Right now it's just a regular polygon sphere. If I press play, you can see the particles are falling. I'm going to hit Alt-B to make it a little bit more obvious and turn off the grid. You can see particles are falling and they fall right through. But if I have the sphere selected and I go into N cloth and I choose create passive collider, now suddenly this sphere has been added as a rigid object to that same nucleus node. So now if I rewind and play, you'll see that our particles collide with the sphere. There's a little bit of an offset which you can control, but that basically is how you would add an object to a nucleus system. And then you can go in here and start to edit things like the behavior of the particles. So if I select the particles, and I'll go down here to shading and set these to spheres as opposed to points. And now I can see they're colliding. And then I could go in here and select the particle nodes themselves. And then with the particle tab selected, I can go in here and start to change things like the lifespan. Maybe I want to have them a random range and set this to like 0.25. So you can see they don't live very long. So if I set this to 1, they live a bit longer. If I set it to 2. And you can also do things like change the particle size over the course of their lifespan. So let's do rated scale input age. So they're going to get smaller as they get older. Then if you want to control the overall dynamics of the system, you can go to the Nucleus tab and do things like if I set the gravity to direction, set the gravity direction to 1, you're going to fall upwards as opposed to downwards. If I set it to -1, but I set the gravity to, say, 0, then we're going to have no gravity. So let's take another object. I'll make a polygon plane. Let's bring this down, scale it up. And with this selected, I'll choose end cloth, create end cloth, which will now make that polygon plane into a cloth object. Let's go back into the Nucleus tab. So I'll just select Nucleus here, set the gravity back to 9.8, and then play. And now we have a cloth system that's also interacting with the particle system as well as the rigid object as well. And then you can go into this cloth system and find the end cloth shape tab. Again, this has a whole bunch of attributes that you can adjust to change its quality, a lot of attributes. Or you can also use one of these presets. So if I click on the preset and select honey, for example, it has a little description down here of how this works. But if we rewind and play, we're going to have a different quality to that dynamic simulation than we did before. It's more kind of gooey. Back in here and play. There we go. And stop it right there. You can go into the effects tab, and there are also some presets like fire and fireworks and that kind of stuff. I mean, these are okay for just fooling around with. I don't know that you want to use them in a professional situation, but they're there, a good way to learn the dynamic systems. Related to end dynamics is end hair, which you find in this menu right here. So I'm going to create a curve. Hit enter. And I'm going to choose end hair, make selected curves dynamic. And let's see, I'm going to hit Alt B so it's easier to see what's going on. And then I'm going to rewind and play. And you can see there's a copy of my original curve that is actually dynamic. So let's set the timeline here to like 600. So you can see it kind of falling down there. And then you can go into the hair system tab and start to adjust the dynamics of the hair system shape tab. And you notice that this is also attached to a Nucleus object. So if I create, say, polygon sphere, let's rewind, move this down here a little bit, scale it up, and choose end cloth, make passive collider, and then play. Let's turn off the grid here. You can see that that hair is going to collide with the sphere, and it'll also interact with particles. I can go into the hair shape here, and by default, it's attached at both ends. So if I say just attach at the base and then play, it will attach just on this one side, but not on the other. And then of course, what you could do is you could select an object and choose end hair, create hair, and it'll create hair on an object which also has dynamic properties to it. This is not the same as using XGen, but it is related. You can use it with XGen. You can use dynamic curves with XGen. XGen is my built-in hair system for creating more realistic hair for characters and things like that. And it's much more involved than the N-hair system. I like to use the N-hair system for creating sort of dynamic chains or effects. You could even loft NURB surface between two dynamic curves and create a flexible surface that way, as opposed to using an end cloth. So lots of interesting capabilities with N-hair. But again, it's part of the Nucleus system. So any other dynamic objects that I add to the scene will also interact with these hairs as long as they're all connected to that same Nucleus node. Let's create a new scene. There are two fluid dynamic systems that come with Maya. One is the older basic fluid system, which is also found in the effects menu set. So if I go in here and choose fluid and create a 3D container, it creates a box. If I press play, we get a little fuzzy blob in the middle. Let's set the timeless slider to 600. If I take a look at the attribute editor, we have a fluid tab, which is the transform node, fluid shape, which is the shape node, and then a time node, and then also a node for the emitter itself. If I expand this in the outliner, you can see we have a fluid shape and a fluid emitter. So if I select the fluid shape, and I'll change the base resolution to 50, and then I'll select my fluid emitter and move it down here to the bottom, and then rewind and play. The basic default fluid system is going to be like a steamy or cloudy kind of system, and you can see it's trapped within this cube. Then you can go in and start to adjust things, like if you wanted to move outside of the cube, you can remove the boundaries. We could say no boundary on X, no boundary on Y, and then as it goes up, it'll just keep going up and it'll just disappear when it goes outside. And you can create things like simple explosions, very simple fluids. If you want to convert this into a mesh and have it interact with other objects, you can do that. Like I say, it's great for simple things. I'll go to Windows, Content Browser, and we can find a whole bunch of fluid effects under the Effects tabs, a bunch of examples. So these are a good starting place to understand how the fluids work. You can also create simple oceans and waves and that kind of stuff. If you were trying to create like a wave that was going to knock over the island of Manhattan or something like that, I don't know, the fluids, basic Maya fluids would be the best choice for that. But for simple stuff, it's great. So Bifrost is the more complex version of the fluid sim, the dynamic sim. It's kind of like having a mini version of Houdini built into Maya. There's a much newer. If I go into Windows, choose Bifrost Browser, we have a whole bunch of presets in here that we can check out. I'm going to take this billowy smoke plume and just double click on it. And you can see we have a node graph. So this is yet another node editor that's part of Maya. This is custom just for Bifrost. It gets a lot more complex than Nucleus or Maya fluids. Let's move over to the side here and minimize this and see if we can play. Yeah, you can see we get a bit more complex fluid example. So it's a very extensive system. Let's turn on caching and rewind. There you go. So this is worth exploring. It's not a system that I'm super familiar with, so that's about as far as I'm going to go on it. But you can take a look. There's some really cool, interesting examples in here, including some really nice fire effects and explosion effects. So if you can't get what you need out of Maya fluids, this would probably be another place to go. And it also has its own cloth-based system, which is different than the Maya Ncloth. So main thing I want to point out is this is just a different system for doing dynamics than the ones that you find natively as part of Maya. So last thing I wanted to introduce is the MASH system, which is a procedural-based animation system. So it's perfect for creating motion graphic style animations using a large number of instances. So I have a simple mushroom scene here. And if I go in here to MASH, I'm in the animation menu set. I'll go to MASH and I'll choose Create MASH Network. It's going to create the default distribution type. So you can see here in the attribute editor, I have a MASH tab, a distribute tab, and a reproduction tab or repro tab. And the distribute tab is going to determine how many instances there are, the type. So if I put this to spherical or let's say radial, increase this, and then I can choose Z offset and so on, and then animate any number of these different attributes. And I can continue to add new effects this way by, say, clicking on this. So let's say I said symmetry. I'll click on this and choose Add Symmetry Node. So you can see it's going to add an additional symmetry node that I can control with this plane, as well as some of these attributes in this symmetry tab. So if I want to have a bounding box or bounding box negative, axis, so on. I can also use the MASH editor. This is essentially the same kind of idea as this tab right here, but you can see the existing nodes that I already have in here, and I can turn them off or on as needed, or I can add new ones. So you have these same options here, the same options here. Let's say I wanted to get rid of symmetry. I'll just delete that. And let's say I'll create like a polygon sphere. And this is great for creating things like forests of trees because you can create thousands and thousands of instances here without too much of a performance hit on Maya, depending on what you're trying to do, obviously. But let's say I'll go to the distribute node here, and instead of radial, I'm going to set this to mesh. Middle mouse button, drag sphere right there, and then add a number of points. And then I could add, say, another animated effect, say something like a signal. And then if I press play, you can see we have happy little mushrooms that are dancing around on top of the sphere. And I can go in here and add this. And you could just continue to layer different effects to create some really interesting, cool motion graphics. That's the basic idea behind MASH. It's a fairly simple system to use, definitely simpler than something like Bifrost, but also extremely powerful. And once you get the hang of it, it's kind of fun to just fool around. So I'll save this so you can take a look at it. So I'll save it as mushroom.ma. There you go. I hope you've enjoyed this Volume 2 Introduction to Maya 2023. And the next volume, we'll talk about shading and rendering using Arnold, as well as how to prepare and export objects for game engines, such as the Unreal Development Kit.